What if the joy on that bear's face isn't joy at all? What if it's a mask, stitched on to hide a terrible secret? We've gotten our hands on a set of encrypted files from a source deep inside the North Pole, a whistleblower. They claim the toys we bring into our homes are actually born from a nightmare. The footage is shaky, the sound is garbled, but the truth is impossible to ignore. What you're about to see won't just ruin your childhood. It will change how you look at every stuffed toy forever. For over 100 years, we've been told a sweet story about how the teddy bear was born. The popular version is that President Theodore Roosevelt was on a hunting trip in 1902 and famously refused to shoot a bear cub that was tied up. The moment was captured in a political cartoon and inspired a toy maker to create Teddy's Bear. It's a wholesome, all-American tale of compassion. Early bears made by companies like Steiff used innocent materials like mohair and wood shavings. But according to our source, this whole story is a carefully crafted fable, a comforting lie to hide a much older, darker truth. Our whistleblower, an elf who calls herself Ilara, says the real story of the teddy bear begins at the North Pole, in a massive industrial complex hidden from satellites by powerful magic. For centuries, this factory has been the engine of Santa's entire global operation. In Ilara's first video, we see the factory floor. It's not the cheerful, candy-colored workshop from the storybooks. It's a huge, sterile place made of steel and ice. Millions of limp, blank teddy bear husks hang from conveyors, moving in a sick, unnatural rhythm. The air doesn't hum with Christmas carols. It hums with the drone of strange machines and a faint, sad whisper you can barely hear. Ilara's camera moves across rows of elves, their faces grim, their movements fast and joyless. This isn't happy crafting. This is an assembly line, a factory producing toys on an unimaginable scale. And it's here, in the cold, sterile heart of the North Pole, that the first and most horrifying secret is revealed. The stuffing. Today, the dirty secret of many toys is environmental. The vast majority of modern stuffed animals are filled with polyester fiber fill, a type of plastic made from petroleum. It's cheap, but making it uses a ton of energy. And because it's not biodegradable, it will clog up landfills and pollute our oceans for centuries. It's a nasty business hidden behind a cute face. But what's happening at the North Pole is so much worse. The stuffing in Santa's bears isn't just plastic fluff. Ilara's footage zooms in on a giant vat filled with a shimmering dark liquid that swirls like trapped smoke. In her notes, she calls it sorrow spun. According to Ilara, Santa's global surveillance network does more than just see if you're naughty or nice. It's a massive psychic machine that harvests humanity's negative emotions, lonely tears, quiet fears, and moments of despair. All of this emotional energy is siphoned, sent to the North Pole, and spun into a physical, fibrous material. The very essence of human sadness is what gives these bears their weight. Each bear is packed not with cotton or plastic, but with a concentrated dose of misery. But that's not even the worst part. The next video focuses on the stitching. We see a close-up of an elf's hands, moving with terrifying speed, not sewing a happy smile, but stitching a jagged, complex pattern onto the bear's face. From far away, it looks like a smile, but up close, it's clearly something else. The narrator in the leaked footage, a grim-faced head elf, explains what it is. These are not stitches. They are runes, magical symbols of containment. The huge amount of raw, negative emotion gives the bears a flicker of something, an echo of consciousness born from pure anguish. If that energy were left unchecked, it would scream. The silent curse inside each toy would be unleashed. That stitched smile isn't an expression of joy. It's a muzzle, a magical gag to hold back the silent scream of 1,000 sorrows trapped inside. Every bear is a prison, and the smile is the lock on the cell door. Think about that. Every teddy bear is a vessel of condensed human sadness, magically bound and silenced. It's a horrifying thought, but it leads to an even darker question. If this is the truth, what happens when the magic wears off? What happens when a stitch comes loose? Tell me what you think in the comments below, and while you're there, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell. You are not going to want to miss what happens next. The last and most disturbing file from Ilara is labeled culling. The video is clearer, like she took a huge risk to get this footage. It shows a different part of the factory, a sterile, white room, dead silent except for the low hum of a furnace. This is where they bring the defective bears for disposal, but these aren't your typical defects like a crooked eye or a torn seam. These are the bears where the curse has become too powerful. The bears that have started to wake up. The footage shows one teddy bear sitting on a steel table. It looks perfectly normal, but as the camera stays on it, you see it. A tiny tremor, a slight unnatural twitch of its head. The head elf from the other video walks in, his face impossible to read. He points to the bear and explains to another elf that its emotional resonance is now dangerously high. The sorrow spun inside it has started to form a proto-consciousness, and the magical runes are beginning to break under the strain. It has become a liability. The camera pushes in, tight on the bear's face. The stitched smile seems to stretch, to twist, as if something is pushing against it from the inside. And then you see the final, soul-crushing detail. From the corner of one of its black plastic button eyes, a single shiny tear wells up and rolls down its fuzzy cheek. A tear made from all the sadness packed inside it. A silent plea from a being that should have never existed. A mechanical claw drops from the ceiling, grabs the weeping bear, and lifts it toward the roaring incinerator. For just a second, its head turns, and its button eyes seem to look right into Ilara's hidden camera. It knows. And then, it's gone. Swallowed by the fire. Its silent, screaming curse finally ended. The video cuts to black. That was the last file Ilara sent. All communication with her went dark right after. We don't know if she was caught or if she just disappeared into the Arctic snow, another soul swallowed by the North Pole's dark machine. What she left behind is a truth that is absolutely chilling. The magic of Christmas, the joy of a child's favorite toy, all of it built on a foundation of harvested sorrow and mystical slavery. The real-world history of teddy bears started with simple mohair and wood shavings, but it quickly became a mass-produced industry that relies on petroleum-based plastics that are now choking our planet. While exact numbers are hard to confirm, a staggering number of toys end up in landfills, a monument to our throwaway culture. But what Ilara's footage suggests is a kind of spiritual pollution that is infinitely worse. A world filled with millions upon millions of tiny prisons, each one holding a piece of our collective pain. So the next time you see a teddy bear, whether it's on a shelf or in a child's arms, look closely at its smile. Is it really a smile of joy? Or is it a desperate, silent seal holding back a darkness we were never meant to see? Look into its blank, button eyes and ask yourself, what is really looking back at me? The magic of Christmas is real, but it's not the magic we were told about. It's the magic of a lock, a key, and a silent, screaming curse.